We are entering the 2024 election in the time of a sea change in how Americans think about and politic about economic policy, and particularly foreign economic policy. And both parties are backing away from longstanding American approaches to the global economy. And we're fortunate today to have as our first visitor Jennifer Harris, who's the director of the Economy and Society Initiative at the Hewlett Foundation. She does not require a lengthy introduction from me because you have been very well introduced to her through your readings. The only thing I'll say, and I'll make it super quick because time is short, is that many people around the world like me desperately try to have our ideas heard by those who matter in the world of policy. It is extremely rare that a foreign policy intellectual, a foreign policy thinker, inserts concepts, ideas, analysis into the policy space that actually end up mattering. And what I can say about Jennifer Harris is she has succeeded in that often sought and rarely achieved career attainment. So without further ado, Jennifer is going to speak for a few minutes about this change and how the United States thinks about and acts towards the global economy. And then we're going to have a chance for a Q&A. Then we're going to take a break, and we're fortunate to be joined in the second part of the class by Professor of Economics Doug Irwin, who I will address more fulsomely in a moment. For now, Jen, allow me to turn things over to you with my thanks for your forbearance and your appearance today.
Thank you. So it's lovely to be with you all. I would like to really make this as much of a conversation as we can to get your questions and advice as we think about what U.S. foreign policy could look like in the next several years. As Professor Woolforth said, we are at a bit of a juncture, and I thought I would start by giving you a sense of how I think about some of this juncture in a little bit more of a thicker historical context. And so I will start a little bit biographically before I get to kind of an intellectual history of some of these kind of more lofty paradigms. So I really began my kind of professional life a little bit in the intelligence world, but mostly at the State Department, where I had the economic portfolio for the policy planning staff. And what I did left my own devices through this was beginning in kind of 2007, 2008. I was on loan from the intelligence world in the Condoleezza Rice State Department under President Bush. And this was kind of in the middle of the China shock, and the assumption that a lot of, I think, the senior political brass in the Bush administration had was a little bit teleological in the sense of, the kind of inevitable river flowing towards, democracy and sort of free market. And there was a kind of causal relationship that as soon as you saw China get rich enough, I apologize, it would, as soon as we saw some income per capita threshold tripped, that we would see democracy and sunshine and puppies sort of spring forth automatically. And obviously that's not at all what we got in the way that China has developed. And I was pretty skeptical of, this kind of all good things go together logic in the kind of Bush administration. And so spent a lot of my time really studying China's economic model, studying its stability, studying the ways in which they were beginning to exert economic muscle, not for economic gain. This was not trade for trade's sake, but specifically for geopolitical outcomes and ends. It was a way of applying economic leverage and throw weight to work one's will in the world and geopolitically. And this was just pretty orthogonal to how a lot of the U.S. foreign policy apparatus thought, at least at that time. And so I think, and when I kind of tried to point this out, and in some ways call for the recovering of certain economic muscles and a willingness in the foreign policy apparatus to use U.S. economic heft for our own set of geopolitical rather than purely economic ends. It was a lot of like heresy, and I was met with a fair bit of pushback. I do remember kind of one specific example of this. This would have been, gosh, when would it have been? Probably like somewhere between 2011, 2012. It was at a kind of boiling point in Israel's concern around Iran's nuclear proliferation. We were kind of at the high water mark of U.S. sanctions that were extraterritorial in nature, attempting to really pressure Iran to a negotiation. And we had basically sparked a currency crisis in the Iranian rial through the application of these sanctions, which were, not for nothing, working pretty well. It seemed like the major exception to the kind of reticence that I'm describing of using U.S. economic and financial might towards some more forthrightly geopolitical ends was really in the sanction space. But it was, I think, allowed to be an exception in the kind of American hive mind on a lot of these things, precisely because it was kind of siloed and codified in its own kind of pocket of, authorities and U.S. law, and it kind of had its own process with some patina of kind of regularity and legitimacy about it and within the bureaucracy. But anyway, these sanctions had worked well enough to kind of spark a run on the Iranian rial, and there were a lot of questions about whether anything could be made of this for additional leverage. And it was clear that the kind of 20% club, the set of countries, U.S. partners, who were still buying 20% or so of their oil from Iran, all of those barrels of oil had to have some kind of shipping insurance that was still controlled through Lloyd's of London in the UK, a friend. And when we required, and we pushed on Lloyd's to kind of end their engagement with their Iranian clients, and so Iran kind of had to create some new JV types of shipping insurance, and it was very clear that like there could have been movements that were made in the kind of currency markets, the spot markets, that could have been executed by anybody with large enough reserves, thinking more like several Gulf countries who had no love lost for the Iranian regime. But kind of even like daring to mention some of these things out loud in a session that was explicitly billed as what do we make of this currency crisis and what could we make of it, was just like met with gasps, because we don't do those sorts of things in foreign exchange markets with official reserves, whether ours or anybody else's. And yet, like, we were within a stone's throw of a real, possibility of nuclear war, probably closer to nuclear war than at any point, and certainly in my lifetime. And there was a kind of like double standard to me that did not make total clear sense. It could have been that there was like a real cascade of horribles that would have come from what I was describing, and that were more risky than the hard security situation that we found ourselves in, with the real possibility of an Israeli attack, preemptive strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. But nobody could have articulated it clearly. Certainly didn't at the time. So that's just kind of a little bit of a taste biographically of kind of where my headspace was. And then I really flipped and started doing much more domestic policy. A lot of that happened through the 2016 campaign. I was on the Hillary Clinton campaign. And it was clear to me that actually this kind of unwillingness to use what I would later come to call economic instruments for geopolitical purposes, stemmed from a much more upstream set of intellectual priors I then left the State Department, wrote a book about a lot of the stuff as cheap therapy, and that's where I kind of really dug into a lot of the history. And the punchline is that it was not always so. Really, the kind of discomfort with kind of deploying U.S. financial and economic heft in this way came right around the kind of rise of the Chicago School, and with which spelled many things for the trajectory of economic policy in the last 40 years, but among them was a view that, you ought not place markets in the service of any kind of national aims, be they foreign policy or domestic. Markets are an end into themselves rather than a tool. So after the Clinton campaign, I was kind of figuring out what I was going to do with myself, because it clearly wasn't going to be in a federal policymaking job in Washington. And it was around that time that I ended up getting married, moving to the West Coast, where my husband's family was located, and kind of beginning this program at the Hewlett Foundation, which was really trying to kind of like stare squarely at a lot of these kind of intellectual priors that, go by different names, call it kind of Washington consensus, call it neoliberalism, call it meatloaf, doesn't really matter. I think broadly we're talking about a view that kind of, ascribes primacy to markets, suggests that individuals are, tend to maximize their own utility, and that is the kind of definition of freedom. Markets are the most efficient ways for that utility maximization to go. And if you buy that kind of positive description of the world as it is, it points pretty squarely to a kind of a set of prescriptions that look pretty predictably like deregulation. Limited sort of tax cuts, limited role for government other than enforcing kind of property rights, some human capital investments around the margins, but a default that has a lot of skepticism about the ability of and propriety of government to kind of set large national aims. I began sort of thinking about really reading in the history of the Chicago School and some of the initial protagonists really that began thinking, working together, in the late 40s, early 50s, and they kind of found a political artery with the election of Reagan and Thatcher, and was sort of off to the races from there. It does, I think, from there, kind of the basic potted intellectual history that I would submit to you is that society is always living in these intellectual boxes. We've, I think, been in, one that looks broadly like neoliberalism, again, call it what you like, for the last 40 plus years, really beginning with, the 10 years of Reagan and Thatcher. But prior to that, it was Keynesianism. Prior to that, it was kind of a laissez-faire liberalism. And prior to that, it was mercantilism. And that these kind of intellectual consensus are only as good as they are useful in solving the practical problems of the day. What do I mean? I mean, they are not right or wrong in any normative sense. They are more or less useful. And when and they tend to fall down in reaction to the just kind of basic problems in the world changing. And these points of transformation tend to be pretty dangerous. It was hardly foregone, just to give one example, when Keynesianism was really congealing into its own orthodoxy, that it would have won out against, I think, several far darker alternatives, some of which did win out in different parts of the world, right? So they are dangerous, but I think they are also shapeable, and that was really the history of how we got neoliberalism, right? It was actually, like I said, it was a deliberate kind of intellectual project. I think, brought about by, a confluence of political philosophers and economists, legal scholars like Frank Knight, he was at the University of Chicago Law School at the time. It was in response to a very real set of challenges in the way that Keynesianism was sort of falling down on the job by the kind of late 1970s. So again, I think the argument or suggestion that I went into the Biden administration with was that we are again at one of these moments of remaking in response to a very different set of exogenous external challenges in the world. You probably have a suspicion about what those are. I think that they were pretty well articulated in the beginning of the speech that I think you all were assigned by Jake Sullivan that I sort of ghost wrote. But that we kind of attempt a sense making of foreign policy, especially foreign economic policy under the Biden administration, by making clear kind of what we're solving for, right? They kind of go through 4 foundational challenges that we felt like we were handed, or we're kind of came into the job, into the White House, really focused on. Things like kind of a, sort of a, certainly climate change and the task of decarbonizing in the time that we have. I think a sense that um, unfettered kind of globalization and the name of efficiency had not worked out very well, either as a kind of foreign policy project or an economic one. Kind of the broad line that, I think many people subscribe to, certainly in the Bush administration, but even prior to that, was essentially that neoliberalism would make for both good foreign policy and good economics. Again, the kind of, I think on the foreign policy view, the idea that kind of subscribing to the basic economic formula would make adversaries, countries like Russia and China, uh, more democratic internally and more peaceable in their relations with external kind of neighbors. I think demonstrably, one need not look further than Ukraine or, most days in the South or East China Sea, or in the kind of saber rattling with Taiwan to appreciate how that has not come to be. I think another great example of, the very real kind of geopolitical failings of a lot of the kind of prescriptions of neoliberalism could be found in the Eurozone. I think certainly that was where I began to really question some of these questions. I think also probably the financial crisis, which I think badly tarnished the US's reputation among the rest of the world, and whether the economic model that the US had subscribed to was one worth emulating. But in the case of the Eurozone, a lot of the economic austerity that was imposed on periphery countries like Greece and abetted by the IMF. You were talking about fire sales of pretty critical infrastructure. The Port of Piraeus was essentially a very strategic port in Greece, essentially auctioned off, I think, to it, and eventually it was the bidders were mainly Chinese and Russian. I think it ended up going to a Chinese state-owned enterprise that gives China a pretty strategic foothold within kind of certainly the Eurozone, within NATO, and that did not seem to be terribly good foreign policy in my view. So that just, again, I'm trying to put a few kind of concrete plot points here on what I realize are kind of 30,000 foot sort of soaring themes, but kind of back to, what we felt like we were solving for. You have, a fair bit of industrial hollowing out that may or may not concern you, depending on some of your upstream economic commitments. I think, to me, the case for investing in manufacturing was not at all really about jobs, quad jobs. It tends to be reduced to that, I think, by skeptics of the Biden administration's manufacturing investments. It's really a sense that you need an innovation commons to make things here forward that you cannot today put a face on. A good example is sodium battery technology that there's lots of reasons why, we've had it since the 70s. That kind of lithium won out initially. I think there's advances very recently in the last, 3 to 5 years that once again makes that commends sodium battery technology as sensible in many use cases. And you see kind of a lot of plant switching going on right now in China, but that can happen because they already have those battery factories that are actually not that hard to switch out from lithium to sodium. And in our case, we're literally building a lot of these plants right now through the investments of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so, there are a couple of sodium battery plants that are going in kind of as greenfield investment, a large one in South Carolina. But I would feel much better about our odds in capturing what I'm bullish on will be a reasonably sized sodium battery market if we had the chance to do some of that, like learning by doing, like on the factory floor. I think actually a lot of China's cost advantages, yes, a healthy amount of them have come from subsidizing for 30 years, but also a healthy amount of them have come from innovations on the factory floor, which can only happen, again, if you have factory floors upon which to innovate. So, it was our view that like when you went down the litany of these discrete challenges, that actually you could multi-solve across them by investing in a key set of backbone infrastructure sectors like clean energy, like technology in the CHIPS and Science Act, like physical infrastructure in what became the bipartisan infrastructure law, and do so not crowding out private investment or displacing it, but rather crowding it in, right? It's sort of public investment dollars that, at least in the case of the IRA, I think the investment multiplier right now is somewhere between 6 to 7 to 1. And in the process, insist on not just jobs, but a certain kind of quality of job, and that in so doing, I think you're showing two things. One, that government can deliver on some of the bigger ticket problems of the day, hopefully shoring up kind of faith in small d democracy, and second, you're fixing some of the political pathologies that I think are the most acute headwinds in problems like climate change. I think the major fundamental shift that the Biden administration made with respect to climate was viewing it not as a market failure, but as a problem of technology and of politics. And I think you're seeing that theory bear some early fruit. I think it's early days, but the fact that you had about 18 Republican members of the House of Representatives send a letter to Speaker Johnson asking that in any of the tax debates that we're gearing up for that will culminate next year, that the IRA tax credits be preserved. That's progress, I think, and in terms of the vindicating the theory of the kind of politics of progress on climate that the IRA was attempting. And so, if all of this goes according to plan, you will have, I think, a more competitive economy, better able to vie with the PRC for a lot of the industries that will shape, the higher value add sectors in your lifetimes and your children's lifetimes. You will have more resilient economy that isn't dependent on a bunch of choke points that are 90% plus controlled by China. It should tensions rise further, and they continue to use some of the choke points as geopolitical leverage, as they've shown willingness to do already. In certain cases with the U.S. directly, but certainly no small amount of export bans and shenanigans of that sort affecting smaller U.S. partners from as far flung as Lithuania to Australia. And then, like I said, the non-trivial progress on just things like decarbonizing in the time that we have. But maybe getting a little bit squarely to the trade piece of this. We are in a hole in several sectors. I was just playing phone tag with a reporter at the New York Times who is looking at some of the CHIPS investments that the Biden administration's made, and Intel, the company Intel, which is incredibly wobbly at the moment, and it being one of the largest recipients of federal CHIPS dollars. My point back to her will be the CHIPS money was like 11 billion or so, 30 billion, and if you kind of add up all the various pots, and that's something like, I don't know, 5 times less than what China is continues to throw at a lot of their chips efforts. I think there's roughly around between 140 and 150 billion dollars in their all-in support for their own domestic chips industry. So they're even as much, I think, warranted attention as the Biden administration's embrace of industrial policy has gotten, there's still just a massive kind of disconnect or difference between the level of subsidies that the Biden administration is insisting on versus what we are seeing from China and have been seeing for decades, which gets me to kind of the other side of a single coin, as I see it, with some of the tariffs that the Biden administration has either maintained from Trump or rejiggered in the case of the tariffs on EVs and EV batteries. I think demonstrably the investments in public investments that have crowded in kind of 7 to 1 private dollars to create an EV sector in the US, like we would be throwing bad money after good if it were not for protecting those investments for some time. I think, I want to be like nimble and fluid on exactly like what the right amount of time is for those industries to get their sea legs before kind of opening up, subjecting it to certainly pressure from the PRC, which again has been the kind of recipient over decades of massive amounts of these kinds of public subsidies. Thing one. Thing two, even as we are, the Biden administration has blocked, but basically put 100% or more tariffs on Chinese EVs, and I think been pretty clear that like we're not interested in seeing Chinese EVs hit our shores in any kind of meaningful measure, and pairing the outright tariffs with kind of regulations that go after some of the security concerns with the ability to, use, control, remotely control EVs through some of the software and hardware in Chinese cars that, there's a reason that we're not buying. I think just as you would imagine that we would have security concerns or lean heavily on Boeing or like to be meaningfully supplying a lot of their kind of remote control software, the kind of like digital portions of any aircraft from China. We should have those same questions and concerns around the same basic components that are going into road transport. And so you've seen in the last few weeks, the Biden administration kind of moving to ban a lot of those hardware and software components in, most forms of road transport. So I think we're seeing a number of signs to suggest that the U.S. will not be throwing its gates open to Chinese EVs. Even as that is so, I think you've seen a kind of hockey stick surge in South Korean and European EV imports, which I would, I point to as a way of suggesting that the U.S. remains very much like open for as a market for imports from a lot of its friends and allies, including on some of these higher value kind of prizes of the next decade or two. And then I think, as for some of the larger architectural questions, I think the Biden administration has been clear that, we do see these markets kind of in a John Ruggie sense, like they are embedded in, a real geopolitical set of realities. And I think the last kind of the post-Cold War era held that at bay for a while, but it was really more the aberration than the norm. I think we are returning to some historical norm where geopolitics is a fact of all of our lives, and it is a fact that should structure a lot of our economic relationships and choices and how we shape markets to serve a set of national prerogatives, whether they're national security or some other set of worthy democratically determined aims. But it probably should mean kind of closer trade with close friends. And so that's when you get to the attempts at some newer forms of architecture that you've seen in the Biden administration, things like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It has a Latin American cousin, the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. I remembered it. And these are attempts at trying to together define how we will friendshore and kind of a lot of the green supply chain questions that have been more rhetorical than real so far. Trying to figure out what kind of broader supply chain resilience should look like so that we don't have shortages that cause massive inflation of like in the sort that we've seen for the past 4 or 5 years. Notably, one thing it does not have is tariff reduction. It's gotten a fair bit of flack for that. U.S. average tariffs on an MFN basis, Doug, you can correct me in a moment, but I believe they're still certainly south of 3%. I think when I was writing Jake's speech a year ago, it was 2.4% globally. I think the suggestion is that if you poll any CEO, most times, if you ask them, would you want to spend years taking that 2.4% down fully to zero? Or would you rather us kind of hammer out a supply chain, resilience sort of blueprint that would make sure that we, for want of a nail, the horse goes lame and kind of get ahead of a lot of those painful choke points, like in chips, that have brought the economy to its knees over the past few years. They would prefer the latter. You don't have to go far to McKinsey or BCG's website to kind of find estimates of how often we can expect these sorts of supply chain problems to rear their head, and how costly they will be. And to bury the lead, they are a lot more worrisome, I think, than kind of the current state of most tariff levels. Um, so that's kind of how we thought about where to really throw our time and energy. And I'm not suggesting that either of them have been a wild success. I have no shortage of criticism for how some of these efforts have panned out. I think it's been a hard time. Doing new things inside the federal government is always hard. Always requires senior attention span and leadership and political capital. And so best not to attempt them when you are also navigating, two land wars, so including one in Europe. I think there's just been a kind of cosmically unlucky hand that the U.S. foreign policy apparatus has been dealt under Biden that has made the kind of walking and chewing gum, the ability to build out some of these next generation economic architectures, incredibly challenging. And then I think I think there's a lesson that to be had here in choosing the right targets for some of this stuff. I designed a negotiation with Europe meant to essentially rationalize the President Trump's steel tariffs, which he essentially put across the whole world on the basis of carbon intensity. So the idea would be to kind of negotiate a common external tariff between ourselves and Europe, and I think, make sure that we have teeth getting at overcapacity, which is a massive problem in terms of the dumping that's still going on, has been going on for the past 3-4 decades from China onto global markets in steel, but that we really figure out a way of, measuring kind of predicating market access on the basis of not just overcapacity, but also emissions intensity, because China's steel, you would not be surprised to hear, was some of the dirtiest around. A lot of it is still coal fired, and to kind of get to the punchline, it was just incredibly. Basically, it was just despite kind of getting a framework agreement out of Brussels in October of 21 and giving ourselves 2 years to really complete the negotiation, it was clear that in their view, this kind of sectoral deal that predicated market access on the basis of emissions intensity was ipso facto WTO uncompliant. I think the U.S. had a different view. I think there's, inherently and as a virtue, a lot of subjectivity in interpreting WTO rules. But there was a kind of like religious kind of stringency on the part of our European counterparts that it was just made it clear that there would be no getting to yes on a deal, and a lot of it had to do with that fact. And I think that there's a lot to especially when you dig into the particulars of something like industrial decarb and the economics of decarbonizing steel and aluminum, which the kind of, if you add cement, are really the largest growing pocket of emissions post IRA. None of those efforts check out without some kind of tariff or tax that is predicated, that is really taking the measure of embedded emissions in these products. So it seems like kind of going back to the external problems that we're facing in terms of what should guide a lot of our upstream priors about what makes for good economic policy. This is a thing that needs doing, and it's a thing that the WTO when those rules were really set up in the late 90s and took effect in 2001 when the WTO came into force, just did not contemplate. The other major existential challenge aside from climate is of course China, just did not really contemplate it. So I guess that would kind of leave me with where I will stop, which is I think this kind of change should be welcome. I think it would be I think we would all be well served to give more thought to how the federal government can be more nimble and more innovative and more responsive to kind of de novo questions. I think another example is a critical minerals agreement that, because it is sectoral, meaning it does not cover, quote, substantially all trade, again, would run afoul of the black letter of the WTO. And yet, I think demonstrably, the ability to pull a lot more rocks out of the ground yesterday is going to be, really important for across a range of equities, from kind of technology, certainly through to building a lot of the batteries that we need and the minerals that will need to go in those batteries. Um, and uh, and it's a thing that has been discussed in the Biden administration since I left. It's something I worked on, and I think the fact of it being WTO uncompliant when there's just no real appetite, I think, among any country, certainly the U.S., but not just the U.S., to attempt a far larger undertaking that would have to touch a lot of the third rails from ag to other forms of subsidies that tend to trip large trade undertakings up. That should not be a thing that hamstrings the ability to go forward with a no regrets sectoral deal of the sort that I mentioned there. I am not particularly bothered by kind of trying to chart out a lot of these practical solutions that are on face not compliant with how the WTO has been interpreted in the last several years. And I think we've seen some ability just since the appellate body has been jammed for countries to settle their own disputes. I think like the Boeing Airbus deal that was reached early in the Biden administration is a good example of countries like figuring out how to have negotiations that land successfully outside of the WTO context. And that there hasn't been a kind of massive unwinding of globalization really in the face of kind of a different direction being charted out first under Trump and continued under Biden. You see kind of most measures of globalization still pretty unfazed by a lot of the rhetoric and in some cases the return to purposive tariffs. I think that will change if Trump is elected and makes good on his suggestions to, with across the board 20 to 60 to 100% tariffs. That seems, pretty insane to me and probably pretty damaging to a whole lot of the parts of the economy. But right now, I would just kind of conclude with the empirical observation that you have incredibly bullish GDP growth in the US. You've got kind of record investment in manufacturing. Again, you've got very strong increases in real wages. You have inflation back at the Fed's 2% target. If you take out housing, it's been under the 2% target. And that's been true for a little while now. You have record highs in the equity markets. Both the S&P and the Dow have reached record highs, multiple times just in the last couple of months. You have record high corporate profits. You have some narrowing in economic inequality. You have really bullish productivity and labor productivity numbers. There's really very little not to like. So you'd have to look really hard to find concerning signals in this economy. It's I think I could say the best that I've seen in my lifetime. For those who want to be data driven about the new kind of economic consensus, I think that we have some early returns and they are promising.
Thanks very much. Let's go right to it. If some students have some questions, I think that's the place to go right now. We got a lot of hands up, but we need to use mics so our esteemed guests can hear you.
Thanks. Hi. My question is referring to how we should navigate all of these challenges when we're considering decarbonization. Particularly, should we implement a carbon price to get around like the Europe carbon border adjustment plan that they're going to implement? How should we go about negotiating steel and aluminum with a climate club like GASA? What should we do? How should we navigate that? And how do we do that without increasing tariffs to prevent leakage of industries that are intensive with carbon?
Great question. Speaking my love language. As I mentioned, GASA kind of started my whiteboard. I still am puzzled at the European resistance. I think it was just a view that on top of their own CBAM, it would make steel kind of too expensive. I think that we finally got that admission out of the chief negotiator very late in the game. So my practical suggestion is just to kind of start with better partners. I probably only half finished that point in my initial laydown. I'm advocating taking the US's initial proposal that we kind of internally had come to in summer of 22 and shopping it with the Canadians and the Australians, who I think I've had dealt with a lot of the trade counterparts in both countries, and have reason to believe that we could get to a deal pretty quickly. So I have no idea whether Catherine Tai will listen to me, but I actually think that this is something that they could get pretty far along with by January, and a lame duck, and would love to see them try. Probably I think for two reasons. One, for a lot of this new stuff, kind of proof of concept is much more important than counterpart. Trade is such a precedent heavy field that it almost doesn't matter who a deal was with, right? The way in which you saw TPP explicitly modeled on the US South Korea free trade agreement is like a good example. So kind of doing it right is much more important than who you do it with. Not that Australia or Canada aren't important, they are. And I think there's reasons that the politics would be easier with those two countries, especially with labor, given that the US United Steelworkers has a pretty substantial membership in Canada. So that's my answer there. And then, I am a big fan of a carbon border measure, partly as I mentioned, because I don't think there's any form of industrial decarb that we know about with the technology horizon that we know of that can happen, without it. And I'm a strong believer that regulation is a means, not an end. We should measure what matters, which is the actual emissions of the widgets that we're making, or would be covering under such a measure, and be agnostic about how you get there. And that's frankly very much in keeping with the spirit of COP, the UNFCCC process. And if the EU's explicit carbon price is working, that should show up, right? In the amount of decarbonization that you see in the actual industrial production. And if it's not, maybe they should, invent some new tools and get a little more flexible on, how they're going after decarbonization. That's hard for reasons hardwired and coded in the very DNA of the EU. There's a reason that they reach more readily for sticks than carrots. It really goes back to, how the EU is put together. I'm not sure that that's our problem. So I would like to see, a CBAM put together that would be on the basis of embedded emissions. That is the basic kind of framework that you see in two pieces of legislation right now in Congress. There's a Republican bill led by Senator Cassidy out of Louisiana, with Senator Kramer and the Dakotas and several other Republican co-sponsors, and then there's the Coons White House Schatz bill on the D side. The major difference between these two bills is the willingness to subject domestic producers to the same standard that they are setting for imports that are coming in. Would I like to see U.S. producers subjected to that same standard? Yes, of course. That's not yet where the Republicans are, but I think that's absolutely a negotiation that we should have. And, as you alluded to, the major concern on a decarbonization kind of plane with a carbon, whether a CBAM of any kind, whether it's kind of on the basis derived from some explicit price or more in the embedded emissions formula that I described, is your, I think, point about diversion, kind of bifurcation of supply. Essentially, if you are trying to import into a country or jurisdiction that does have a carbon border measure, you'll send your clean stuff there and you'll send your dirtier stuff, to the rest of the world. I think that's easily fixed as a design matter. I think you can build in a national average in addition to really wanting to be pretty facility or product specific in how you are adjudicating and kind of judging the carbon content of any of the imports. You can build in a kind of a national average to get at that bifurcation problem, and you would want to make sure that you write the legislation, or this is actually doable as a matter of executive authority. Say White House counsel, lawyers. We'll see if if that I think there's a healthy belief in a lot of the executive branch that if we wanted to, you could use some things like section IEPA or section 301 to pursue a carbon measure through the executive authority alone. Anyway, there are the basic point is I think there's a number of ways you can skin the kind of policy design cat to get at the some of the questions and concerns. And I would also like to see a fair amount of the revenues from such a thing rebated to the rest of the world to kind of to help with climate finance. And if that were to come to pass, it would probably be the I don't want to say the most meaningful, but a very meaningful injection of real dollars into climate finance, which I think addresses some of the kind of developing world and emerging market questions, as well as the kind of loopholes that you could also design and kind of maintenance of effort requirements for some of the poorest countries. And really, it's mostly a middle income problem right now, and not a developing country problem. And when you look at who actually has a steel industry that is exporting, it's more Brazil and Turkey than it is. I don't think there's a single exporter in sub-Saharan Africa.
All right, but I have to say, let's get one more question before we take a break. And with indulgence, we'll have to keep both questions and answers pretty short because of this press of time.
What are your thoughts on the Biden administration blocking the sale of U.S. steel to a Japanese company?
And Bill, did you want to take one more?
Yeah, okay. Let's add another one. That's a great question.
Do you think that the Biden administration would have taken such a bold approach to industrial policy if the Trump administration hadn't set a precedent of more severe protectionism before? Do you think there's a cause and effect there? Or do you think both administrations came to independent economic policy?
Good questions.
Yeah.
On U.S. steel, I think we have I think there is a slight concentration problem. The fact that we really only have 3 steel companies in the country, and Cleveland-Cliffs, if the sale were to go through to Cleveland-Cliffs, it would be producing this, I think 100% of the steel that's going into our EVs. Concerns me. That's a little bit to one side of your question. I do think that there is a virtue to having some of the most sensitive national security sensitive sectors of our economy fully in domestic control. And that's not exactly like an exotic view. Today, in the last recent weeks, you've seen the Defense Department continue its insistence that it source chips from purely American companies, and that it means like a reticence to source chips from TSMC operated facilities that are being produced in the U.S. And that was why you saw kind of a $3 billion line go to Intel rather than kind of TSMC for production in Arizona. So there's I think a longstanding kind of precedent in the U.S. for really wanting to make sure that if we needed to gear up quickly, for a wartime economy, that we see a lot of the kind of vital organs of like a war footing be in purely solidly American hands. That said, do I think that the sun wouldn't rise in the east if Nippon were to take over control of U.S. Steel? No, I'm probably comfortable with it. I think the piece that concerns me the most is actually the massive sort of parachute compensation package that the U.S. Steel CEO would get, and it was like something like $200 million if the sale went through. I think that those kinds of incentives are incredibly problematic and should be quashed, and so that's probably the main reason why I don't want to see this deal go through. On the question of like how much kind of creative destruction did the Trump administration bring us? I think a fair bit. Again, I have like more than a few quibbles with the how, but I do think that their willingness to, call some pretty hard questions that were overdue in the US's trade relationship with China was, work that the Biden administration didn't have to do itself. I think I've been pretty forthcoming about that fact in various public writing that I've done. And like I said, I think there is a whole lot in the how of both kind of hard pivots where I think they're warranted, and the kind of building of new architecture. And I didn't exactly see much to commend the Trump administration in that kind of building of any affirmative new kinds of economic tables or fora. And at least we have like some points on the board and some basis to build from after 4 years in Biden.
Thanks so much. Hey, let's just hold some of those questions, keep them in your minds. Let's give ourselves and our guests 3 minutes or 4 minutes to take a break, and then we'll come back and hear a little bit from Professor Irwin, and then we'll polish it up with some more Q&A. All right, 5 minutes. We are ready. If people can resume their attentive stances, seats. So we're fortunate also to have at Dartmouth, there are voices in this world that are concerned about the change in American and global attitudes towards trade and other cross-border economic exchange. Could we be going too far? Is it possible that concerns over issues other than economic prosperity that concern national security, geopolitical competition, environmental climate change, et cetera, are they possibly leading things too far? I am not going to prejudge what my colleague, Professor Doug Irwin of the Economics Department is going to say, but it might be something along those lines. He's going to take 10, 12 minutes to do that. Then we'll have an opportunity to bring Jennifer Harris back in and a more general conversation. So Professor Irwin, who is not only a distinguished trade economist, but also an economic historian, who's written what may well be and probably will always be seen as the definitive study of U.S. politics of trade policy. So he's coming at you with a good degree of scholarship and a good degree of experience. So please, Doug, take it away.
Thank you very much. I hope you appreciate what a special class you're in. This is pretty unique to have all these distinguished visitors come in, not me, but Jennifer Harris and others, and have 3 great professors in doing so. Now, I didn't know what Jennifer Harris was going to say, and I'll wave. We've never met, but I've read your work and appreciate your contribution to this debate. So I'm going to present what I'll call a neoliberal globalist take on trade. I didn't know exactly what she was going to say, so I may skip around a little bit, but try to address some of the points and provide a different perspective. I say neoliberal globalist because people on the progressive left would dismiss me as a neoliberal, and those on the neocon right would dismiss me as a globalist. So I'm sort of in this camp where I thought sort of the post-World War II system was pretty good. However, I agree with Jennifer, there have been some major changes, and so some updating has been needed. Once again, I didn't know what Jennifer was going to say, so I tried to anticipate what she might say. And I'll just say I agree on a couple of things and maybe disagree something that she didn't emphasize quite as much. But I'll probably disagree more with the Trump approach to trade than with the Biden approach to trade. But I'll talk about both of them. So first of all, I would agree that the world trading system rests on geopolitical foundations. You can't ignore those. Foreign policy, sort of Trump's trade policy in many respects, and that our national security is an absolute priority. And that's the second point here, that this is actually something that Adam Smith said, one of the greatest free traders, the author of The Wealth of Nations. Defense is more important than opulence. So if there's an issue that is of national security concern, and there's a trade-off with economics or free trade, my gosh, you dump the economics, you go for security. Of course, there's a trade-off, and there's a degree of what trade-off you're willing to make, but that's absolutely something that I think most economists accept. We haven't had to deal with it so much over the past 40 or 50 years or so until recently. Where I might disagree, and I certainly would disagree with the Trump approach, some of the rhetoric that comes from the Biden administration saying trade policies in the past have been very bad, They've harmed the middle class. They've hurt the manufacturing sector. We need a complete rethink over what's going on and dump those things. Now, just to give you a little background in terms of what's going on, we had for many years after World War II sort of a framework for thinking about trade policy, whereas we want to expand trade. We had a lot of trade barriers coming out of the war as a result of the Great Depression. We wanted to bring those down. We thought it was in our national interest to do so. So we reached trade agreements such as the WTO or GATT, NAFTA with Mexico and Canada, and a bunch of these other things. And since the Trump administration, they've really overturned that whole system. So Trump said he hated NAFTA, worst trade agreement ever. He didn't ditch it, however, interestingly. He just renegotiated it in something called the USMCA because you couldn't have trade in it, you couldn't have free. So it's just known as, it's the most bland agreement ever. US, Canada, Mexico agreement. Doesn't say anything about anything else, but it's basically NAFTA. It didn't really change all that much except in the autos. Steel tariffs, China tariffs. Biden administration has kept on this Trump tariffs, but has also moved on towards industrial policy. I'll talk a little bit about that. One question that I hope you're thinking about, well, at least sort of I do, having seen some of these changes, why has this happened? Why is there this revulsion against trade on both sides? And why is there this rejection of past presidents? So not progressive Democrats, they reject the Clinton-Obama inheritance, saying they were sort of neoliberal. All these presidents for the past, those 40 years, all sort of dismissed as neoliberal. National conservatives, Trump, J.D. Vance rejects Reagan, rejects Bush. They're just free marketeers and free traders, and they sold out America. And what's sort of interesting is that Vance, Rubio, Warren, Sanders, they don't like big corporations. They don't like big tech so much. They think they really want a strong welfare state, and they don't like free trade. But let me turn specifically to trade policy. So first of all, what I've suggested, a lot of what we've heard of as problems aren't necessarily as big a problem as we thought. But President Trump, and to a lesser extent President Biden, have said that maybe tariffs are the answer, or tariffs are a tool that can help us. And President Trump, former President Trump, he said they're the greatest thing ever invented. He likes to use tariffs. Tariffs are, of course, taxes on imports. He thinks that it'll help solve the child care crisis. I'm not sure exactly how or what the mechanism is, but that's sort of this unleashing of tariffs as being useful. And every Thursday at noon, The Economist puts online its new edition, and of course I go for it at lunchtime. And this is in today's Economist, How America Learned to Love Tariffs. So tariffs are on the agenda. So what do I think about tariffs? Actually, it doesn't matter what I think, but here's what the sort of economists overall think. It reduces national income. It's a regressive tax on consumers. It leads to an appreciation of the US dollar, which hurts US exporters. It costs jobs in downstream industries, and it sparks foreign retaliation against US exports. I would exempt from this what Jennifer Harris talked about in terms of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a little bit different and has a different rationale and different economic effects, because it's compensating for an international problem where we're taxing domestic producers. We can talk about that later. Just very quickly on each of these. Even the CBO says, evaluating the Trump tariff program, it's going to reduce level of GDP by 0.5%. That amounts to about $1,200 per household. So that's not making the pie bigger. That's not redistributing things in a better way. That's actually shrinking the pie. And when we shrink the pie, who bears the cost? Lower income households, because they spend more of their goods, more of their income on traded goods. So look at the yellow lines here. This is by income quintile. There's an assessment of the Trump tariff plan for higher tariffs across the board. Lower incomes are going to suffer more in terms of lost income than richer households. So this is a regressive policy. And here's just showing you, and I can share these slides later, on how much are spent on actual goods. What about getting jobs back? That's what President Trump said in imposing these tariffs, and he especially wanted tariffs on steel to get people working again. Well, first of all, it's not like, yes, there is some dumping in the world markets. We have tariffs called anti-dumping tariffs against those, but it's not as though imports were surging in 2016, 2017, 2018, destroying the US steel industry. The import penetration ratio was fairly constant. But we imposed these tariffs ostensibly on grounds of national security, even though the Department of Defense said there was no national security case for these tariffs, prices went up when you imposed the tariffs by about $200 a ton, which, well, we don't go out and buy steel, but I'll show you who does. That made US steel prices higher than those in Europe or in Asia or elsewhere, and led to a cost disadvantage for US producers. So Ford, I don't buy steel directly. Ford does. Ford buys a lot of steel. Their costs went up $1 billion. That's not helping American workers. That's not helping American manufacturing. That's taxing their inputs. If you make steel trailers, you're raising the cost of all your inputs. If you make kegs, you're raising the cost of the steel and aluminum. And this is a big issue across campuses. Yeah, what are these for? Well, actually, we don't use them here. We have Keggy. But, Dartmouth bans kegs. So you didn't pay the price because Keystone Light, nothing but the best for us. Keystone Light is where we go. But the point is, you lose jobs in downstream industries. And we lost many more than we gained in the steel industry because we have about 10 or 20 to 1 is the ratio of downstream users of steel compared to producers. And then, of course, there's backlash. The rest of the world said, oh, you impose tariffs on steel, we're going to do that same on you. And the EU Director General said this, President said this is great. We have to do stupid too. Okay, you put on those tariffs, we're gonna have to retaliate. And so this is the political cartoon just saying, okay, we impose these tariffs, but boom, it comes back and hurts our exporters of whiskey, our exporters of blue jeans, our exporters of Harley Davidsons and things of that sort. So tariffs, I don't think, are a good policy instrument to achieve many things. Now, the question is, how about industrial policy? Because here we turn to the Biden administration a little bit. We have industrial policy regarding semiconductors and EVs, and here is my big answer. Is industrial policy a good idea or not? Maybe. As an economist, waffle. Because, well, first of all, there's some advantages to that. First of all, at least there's an objective here. With semiconductors, it's national security. We don't want all, first of all, China didn't take our steel chip industry. It's all in Taiwan or South Korea. They're allies, they're friends, they're great producers, but they're geopolitically vulnerable. So should we spend some money bringing some chip production back home? Sure, sounds like a reasonable idea. Green transition, great idea. Subsidies are better than tariffs or protectionism because you don't get quite the, for various reasons I just went through, with regressiveness and what have you. There's some cons too. This could be corporate welfare. It could be everything bagel policies where it's not just subsidizing chips, but you've put on all these conditions in terms of what you have to do to produce the chips in the US, and that just raises costs. There could be some waste. Is it worth trying? Sure, absolutely. Let me just talk quickly about China, then wrap up. As I mentioned, President Xi changed a lot in terms of global geopolitics. Took China a different path. China is definitely a non-market economy. They're not a friend. We don't have to treat them the same way with respect to trade. Just some pictures on this. The state strikes back. It's become much more interventionist. The Communist Party is much more, has a say in terms of how the economy is run. But let's put things in perspective. I don't think we have to revamp all of US trade policy just because of China. We get about 18%, 16% of our imports from China. We ought to deal with that. But with the rest, our allies, we should still be having open markets. Now that said, so I have no problem here with sanctions against China or special trade policy vis-a-vis China, but let's be honest. Whether it's going to change their behavior, I don't know. I defer to political scientists and professors in the government department. It's not going to bring the jobs back if we just have special tariffs on China. We pay the tariffs when we impose them on China. It's not China paying the tariff, despite what President Trump has said in the past. And once again, we didn't lose semiconductors to China, but we do get really cheap solar panels from China. Now, we can try to resurrect that industry here, but maybe we ought to just accept a lot of cheap solar panels. Our trade agreement's a bad deal. Don't have time to go for that. We talked about foreign investment. So let me just sum up by saying this. As you're confronting in this course, we face a lot of problems in terms of the US economy, things we're facing as a society, high cost of health care, housing, education, just infrastructure, building things. Guess what? None of these have to do with trade or globalization. Trade and globalization is not the primary problem we're facing. We should be focusing on trying to strengthen the American economy through all these domestic measures. And yes, trade is a part of it, but it's not a huge part of it. All these other things, we can't lay the blame on other countries. We have to fix these things ourselves. Thank you.
Now, wait a minute. We have to bring our other screen back. Hold on. I'm sure that's extremely easy by ending show. Here we go, and clicking on our other thing here, Zoom. Okay. That's exactly what I intended to do. I meant to do that. There we go. Piece of cake. Thank goodness we have someone who knows what they're doing. So, yay! So I don't know. I felt like there was a lot of overlap, and a lot of it directed at the Trump administration. But I do want to give Jen just a chance if you have any thoughts in response to Doug before we go back to the audience.
Yeah, and thank you, Doug. It's good to meet you virtually. Likewise, been a big fan for a while, and have long followed and appreciated your work. Unfortunately, I don't know if Doug was just using kid gloves today or not, but I think there is a fair bit of agreement here. So let me try to sharpen a little bit of disagreement and then pull a few threads that we can open it up with. Probably the largest point of disagreement is unsurprisingly around the kind of magnitude and endurance of the harms from China specifically. Doug, I'm sure that you saw at the time Melissa Kearney and Catherine Abraham's work really trying to distinguish this kind of narrower question of was it China or was it robots? And their finding was between 1999 and 2016 or so, you saw about just over 2.5 million jobs lost to China, and that China was, the single largest cause, larger than automation, for U.S. job loss. And then, David Otter's more recent work has, followed some of the places of most acute hollowing to China exposure to find that, once the going gets tough, I think to use his phrase, the tough rarely get going, that you really haven't seen much in the way of bounce back to some of these acute areas that have been hollowed out. I would just kind of offer that back for any specific thoughts. But I think broadly, it sounds like you and I both agree that that we're not trying, we should not be, to go normative, trying to, kind of stop importing everything from China. There is a lot of economic independence between the U.S. and China, kind of, I think, record bilateral trade imbalances between the two countries are close there too. Kind of even today still bear out that point. But rather, we do want to figure out, we want to set some national aims, and we want to put our markets and our economic policy, including our trade policy, in service of those aims. And that, to me, is the big idea that is really breaking ranks with what I think of as neoliberalism. The question of new directions in trade policy or industrial policy are downstream of that basic insight. Thing one. Thing two, I veer towards history with some reticence, given Doug's expertise here. But Doug, correct me if I'm wrong, I think prior to the WTO, the track record for any similarly genuine multilateral open trade arrangement is historically very few and short-lived. I think you can find only two. I think it's the Anti-Corn Law League from the British that lasted 6 or so years until Germany's rise kind of forced a retreat back into an imperial preference scheme, and the Anglo-French Commercial Treaty of 1786, which lasted 3 years until the French Revolution. And that's about it in terms of corollaries or to what the WTO has been. And the WTO really kind of had from 2001 to, depending on when you want to date some of its headwinds, whether that was with the Doha round really dying in 2012 probably, or the kind of headwinds of TPP. This is not exactly like kind of the we were a set of orthodoxies we were living under for norms for decades. I thought we actually got along quite well and did most of the important work of tariff reduction from 45 to 2001, living under the GATT. Sun still rose in the east. So that's kind of why I'm a little bit unfussed about and just not interested in these kind of WTO, quad WTO debates. Yeah, so and then I think that kind of the big question is like, so kind of what is the affirmative vision? To my mind, I violently agree that like the areas of largest cost are the ones on your final slide there. My problem with TPP was really a problem of political economy. A lot of the things that were opening markets, kind of the areas of offense, are exactly what you expect when you think about who has power in the U.S. economy and who doesn't. It was like making the world safe for a bunch of like U.S. financial firms. Like there was not a whole lot in there about importing more nurses or doctors, which I would love to see as a way of fixing some of our healthcare shortages. There's a lot of like pharma IP stuff that felt like a total giveaway to big pharma. And I think that's probably a little bit endemic to our political system. Not to say that, and I think your reservations around industrial policy are exactly right. I kind of liken it to a 3-act play. The first act we've largely accomplished. It was the blunt force stuff of subsidies, tax credits, and tariffs. Act 2 is the kind of more active babysitting, the kind of this questions around Intel today. Once you shovel a ton of taxpayer dollars into some of these large companies, like can you see through what you're trying to get out of them in the first place? I would love to see these dollars come with not everything, more everything bagel strings of the sort that you described, Doug, but rules against no buybacks. The point here is that we are supposed to be building things, and the admission implicit in a buyback is a CEO is saying, I have nothing better to do with shareholders' money, so I'm going to return it to them, as well as kind of minimums on R&D thresholds. Those are a few responses, but in general, I think actually a fair bit of agreement.
Cool.
Thanks.
Well, why don't we allow things, I would love to hear some more questions from the students. I do have a question. At some point, if we can have you guys thoughts on how this issue plays out in this election and how you react to how it is playing out in the election, if at all. Because where a lot of the consensus was in these two presentations was that there is actually a choice here between these two candidates, between these two parties regarding the things that you care about. But let's just keep that in vain. But keep in our minds that this class is about the 2024 election in a way, using the 2024 election as a way of understanding issues like the ones being discussed today. So if questions can kind of key into that a little bit, that would be awesome. Please. Whoops. Mike is coming.
Okay. My question, I guess specifically for Professor Irwin, but both can answer, obviously. I mean, you mentioned that, like the Economist article, that Americans love tariffs now, but if they're such a bad idea, why are they so popular?
Well, first of all, I think that just appeared today, and I don't think they're terribly popular. I think Kamala Harris has done a really effective job in saying it's a sales tax on all Americans. That's sort of a way to just sort of, set off in people's minds. Once again, you probably get into this in your class. Framing issues is so important, and how you justify it and what have you. So if you're President Trump, you say, this brings back jobs. This raises revenue for us. They're paying it. They're paying us. That's one framing. It's not really the underlying economics of it, but that's a way of spinning it. But I think the Harris view of saying this is a tax increase on everyone, a sales tax increase, that sort of just brings it home. Oh, this is what it actually means. And in particular, I think what President Trump doesn't do is differentiate, friends and non-friends. So he's not saying we're going to tax our enemies overseas. He wants to tax everyone. He viewed Canada as an enemy in the NAFTA negotiations and what have you. So I think that not differentiating hurts that case.
Jen, anything to add?
No, not really.
Right.
I think it's mostly just an easy signal to, I think there's a kind of like I forget, there was a great op-ed in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago suggesting that kind of like there's deviations from expected lines as a potent way of kind of showing the electorate kind of whose side you're on. And I think this is an example where the tariffs still have a bit of like a naughty odor to them, and so they're kind of the willingness to embrace them is a kind of an easier way of breaking through the noise to land a point. And in general, I think that you've seen Harris pretty uncomfortable with make a real affirmative point of offense out of Trump's blanket tariffs. The last thing I would just add was around NAFTA, the USMCA. I think you see both candidates as of today exercise that agreement's 6-year renegotiation clause, a kind of a suggestion that they will exercise that clause. I think that clause was a really important innovation in free trade agreements to make clear that these things are a snapshot, negotiated in a certain snapshot in time and cannot be expected to anticipate all of the curveballs that the future will throw, and that those kinds of like clauses that allow for a natural like check-in point are probably going to be pretty important for any continued progress of the sort that we've come to expect over the past 50 years for like FTAs in any kind of familiar sense.
Yeah. Please, yep.
Hi, thank you for being here today. So what would you say to the Tucker Carlsons of the world who would argue that like in a country in which, say, 1/3 of the population has a bachelor's degree and the rest can't get jobs that need a formal education, how would, like, if we eliminate tariffs, a lot of jobs that are going to disappear, even if it's going to slow down the economy efficiency-wise, what is that tens of millions of people in the population going to do if they don't have any way to contribute to the economy? Like, would you propose something like universal basic income as society becomes more technologically advanced and more automated?
Is that for me? Okay. So many things there. I'll try to remember each point. First of all, I still think there are a lot of opportunities for people without a formal bachelor's degree. I mean, try hiring an electrician in the Upper Valley. Try hiring a plumber in the Upper Valley. You do need a skill. You do need a trade, but you can do very well. And as I pointed out, tariffs are very regressive. So it's the lower incomes that are going to pay the price in some sense. Now, there may be some individuals who, even in a strong labor market, don't have the skills or what have you. We have to help them out, okay? So maybe some universal basic income there. But once again, it hurts, it doesn't make manufacturing bigger, these tariffs, because of the downstream effects. So we've lost manufacturing jobs in downstream industries that use steel. So we're not helping those workers. So when we talk about a worker-centered trade policy, you have to ask the question, which workers? The steel workers versus the auto workers. There's a trade-off there. So closing ourselves off from the rest of the world, it's not a recipe for growing the economy. It's not a recipe for helping those at the bottom end of the income distribution.
Further thoughts? Great. Let's bring let's take maybe two different questions, and then our people can pick and choose and answer as they wish. Yeah.
Just from a national security perspective, are we okay with the U.S. losing majority of its manufacturing to overseas, even if bringing manufacturing to the U.S. doesn't increase jobs? I feel like that is like becoming less reliant on China is a fear or a goal that I have for the U.S. Not that I'm a policymaker or very learned on this subject.
Okay, let's hold that, and yep.
I wanted to quickly return to USMCA because it's being renegotiated, or there's the renewal in 2026. And so my question is, with a Harris administration versus a Trump administration, what specific demands do you think will be asked from Mexico and Canada? Because I know in Canada, the big concern is supply management getting mutilated for, grain, dairy, and so on. So what do you think the two policies would look at depending on the two parties in power?
Just quickly on that. So I think the Harris administration might tweak it a little bit. The Trump administration, who knows? Because he's already talked about 200% or 300% tariffs on cars coming from Mexico, which first of all violate the basic underlying assumption of the agreement. So he might literally blow it up and think the USMCA was a bad deal too. I will disagree with Jennifer on one point about whether having an automatic renegotiation point at every, like 6 years is a good idea or not. I think we should let these agreements run, and we can renegotiate anytime if we think the conditions have changed, but you don't set up a terminal point. You know, what if when I proposed to my wife, I said, I will marry you for 6 years, and then we'll talk about it again. I mean, that would be a non-starter, I think. So
I think
I
so,
didn't
yeah.
suggest
I
that.
think that would be a non-starter, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, on the other question, let's see, on
So
manufacturing.
what's the value?
Oh.
I think he's partly asking the intrinsic value of having industry located here. I mean, it seems like there's 3 tiers of this conversation, and some of it's in our reading, and there's industry located here, there's industry located in stable democratic allies, and then there's industry located in potential adversaries. So, like, what's the value of this just overall?
Well, first of all, one second, we have to ask the premise, have we lost all of our manufacturing? We haven't. We've lost a lot of the jobs. We're still manufacturing a lot of things, particularly at the high end. Then we get the question, okay, so are there certain strategic industries that we really need production here? So semiconductors might be one of those, and the CHIPS Act is trying to do that. You're the national security guy. Do we need domestic production of drones? Maybe, because it looks like if we look at various wars around the world, drones are really important. And we can't be necessarily importing our drones. So we might need a defense program regarding domestic production of drones. I'll leave that to the national security crew. But I think that's where we have a debate, and we have to draw a line somewhere. It's very difficult to know exactly where to draw the line. But once again, I don't think we're in such a dire situation that we need more of everything in manufacturing. You know, we don't produce many of our, look, we're wearing clothes and shoes. I dare say most of the things you're wearing are imported, and that's fine. Not a really national security issue. It's not really a jobs issue. So I'm not really concerned about textile and apparel and footwear, as we need a national policy for that. Others may differ. Let's have the debate.
Yeah. So Jen, like the two questions on the table, basically are renegotiating of the I still going to call it NAFTA because I grew up calling it NAFTA, and the other is, well, more or less what you've already talked about a good deal, which is how to think about the value of having more industry located within the borders of the United States as opposed to allies or adversaries.
Sure. So quickly on what you would expect under a Harris administration in terms of quibbles from USMCA, my sense is that the UAW was a driving force behind her coming out with a suggestion that she would avail herself of the option to reevaluate it. And I think the main concern there is a lot of investment, Chinese investment that has gone into the Mexican sort of auto supply, kind of auto parts supply chain. This is something that I certainly got an earful from even prior to the IRA's passage. And I think, you know, again, insofar as one of the IRA's main goals is to diversify our supply chains out of China, having a kind of 5-lane highway in the form of USMCA via Mexico for a bunch of Chinese-owned parts. And I think there is a fair bit of Chinese content. I don't exactly know whether it's over or under some of the content thresholds within USMCA that is coming through Mexico and their auto parts supply chains. So that's what I understand to be the main point of concern on this larger question about the virtue of a manufacturing base. You know, I think I land somewhere in the middle in that, as I mentioned earlier, I do see value in having a purposive manufacturing base beyond national security, really because it's kind of evergreen development policy. I think we think a lot about development policy as something that is for the rest of the world and not for OECD countries or G7 countries. But there's a fair bit of evidentiary support in the literature to suggest that it's not something that a country ever really graduates out of as an income per capita matter, and that it is that more than anything else, a country's ability to make things is what determines its ability to innovate here forward in ways that no one could be expected to kind of put a precise face on ex ante. That was kind of the point about my extended example on, various battery chemistries and battery manufacturing.
Great. Yeah, do we have our microphones? Yeah. No, well, we want to make sure that Jennifer can hear you.
Thanks. Yeah, Professor, I would love to hear you respond to that, the innovation thing. I mean, if we don't have manufacturing here, how does that impact our ability to innovate? That's it.
Apple is very innovative. They don't manufacture much here. So, no, I accept that point, that having domestic manufacturing does help innovation, but it's not always the case. Europe, Mario Draghi, former Prime Minister, I believe, or President of Italy, recently came out with a report in Europe saying, their problem is innovation. And you don't look to trade policy necessarily. One of the things I think we should be looking at much more carefully is tax policy. We don't want tax incentives for U.S. corporations to offshore some, for tax reasons, investment revenue, intellectual property holdings, saying the R&D is being done in Ireland. So tax policy, I think, is much more important than trade policies in terms of helping manufacturing. So I'd look there more. So I think we are, because of VC culture and things like that, we are very innovative. And I'd look to non-tariff measures to sort of help continue that and foster that.
Okay, well, we're closing in on time, and Professor Nachlas has asked for the professor privilege of asking the last question.
Before the last question, just thank you both for an extraordinary conversation. Last question is with the hope of ending on a point of agreement. And so I'm wondering if you both agree with the following, which is that Jennifer Harris is right on this meta-narrative of neoliberalism's, whatever that is, sort of rise and partial fall. And Doug Irwin is right in his diagnosis of our present maladies as principally coming out of the global financial crisis and not pathologies of trade. But then the Harris response plausibly being that the GFC itself was caused by a structural problem with the prior approach to neoliberalism, and we've now moved beyond that. Is that an appropriate synthesis of your views, or am I trying too hard to get everybody on the same page?
Great. Why don't we, Doug, and then why doesn't Jen get the last word?
Jen first.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like I get more questions about trade than I like, so my largest beef is with neoliberalism in all of its manifestations, and the best that I've been able to do, I forget exactly which of my writings Professor Wohlforth has inflicted on you, but I wrote a piece in late August that I was just wish casting somewhat onto the trajectory of economic policy under a Harris administration based on what her campaign had put out at the time. But I think there was enough in the data points to kind of draw one story that is firmly continuing a building out of the successor to neoliberalism. But to me, the two most important ideas there are, one, like a willingness to the point that like having markets does not relieve democratically elected government of setting worthy national aims and bending and shaping markets in the service of those aims, a recognition contra neoliberalism that markets are one tool, they are not a means in themselves. That's an idea. I think it's a pretty big idea. I think that's one half of it. I think the other half is, so I call that build. The other half of my bumper sticker here is balance, which is, I think the big idea is to argue that markets left to their own devices inherently concentrate, supercharge asymmetries of power and a bunch of different like flavors of markets, imbalances between workers and employers, imbalances between small firms and big firms, imbalances between finance and the real economy, the rest of the economy, imbalances between China and its throwaway globally and the rest of the world. And it is therefore the job of government to get foot forward and proactive in rebalancing those inherent tendencies of markets on their own to propagate those power imbalances. And that is, I think, the intellectual spine connecting a fulsome re-embrace of antitrust, which is somewhat a jump ball more than I would like in terms of whether Lena Khan can expect to hold on to her job, and Doug Cantor, Jonathan Cantor, at DOJ, and kind of a fulsome approach to antitrust. It's there in the kind of re-embrace of labor unions as cool again, which is a big difference between, I think, economic policy under the tenor of it under Barack Obama or Clinton, and Joe Biden is in the kind of willingness to bear hug labor as cool. It's there in, I think, the kind of the willingness to apply purposive tariffs in a different way of thinking about trade policy. So I am hard pressed to do better than a kind of like build and balance kind of lay sketch that's intelligible in the public domain for what seems to be coming into view as a successor to neoliberalism.
Awesome. Last word, colleague?
It's hard to, so first of all, you just had a very eloquent statement about build that I very much liked. Can't remember now exactly what it was, but hats off to you. But this term neoliberalism, I do have some problems with it. And I think one of the issues is if we look at sort of the thinkers that we assign in our classes, the strands of thought, one of the leading economists in this realm would be Milton Friedman. If you read Milton Friedman, he'll take a very strong view, very extreme view in some sense. And you say, he was, heralded as, an important economist during his day. But when you look at what actually governments were doing, we have an industrial policy towards agriculture. So when you look at, I think, the reality of what government does day to day in terms of regulation, in terms of spending, in terms of taxing, the government's always been there. Whether you call that era neoliberalism or not, the question is, and maybe we can agree on this, is government policy acting in the best national interests and making the U.S. a more prosperous, stronger place, or is it acting on behest of special interests and therefore detracting from what we're all trying to achieve together as citizens?
Well, I think on that positive note, I think we can all thank both of our guests today.